Welcome back to the Watching Brief in 2024, and we begin with a breaking news report, and that is that a High Court judge has dismissed all but one of the grounds that the Stonehenge Alliance and other campaigners argued to stop Highways England's plan to build a tunnel and dual carriageway within the Stonehenge and Avebury World Heritage Site. The Alliance says it'll seek leave to appeal the decision. Now, the campaign to prevent the government roads body, National Highways, from building a tunnel and dual carriageway across the Stonehenge and Avebury World Heritage Site in Wiltshire suffered the blow in the High Court when Mr. Justice Holgate ruled that the decision of Transport Secretary Marc to greenlight the controversial project back in last summer was actually lawful. Now, the Save Stonehenge World Heritage Site group, that's an umbrella organisation representing opponents of the project, including perhaps the better known Stonehenge Alliance, had argued on 8 grounds that Mr. Harper's decision to grant what's called a development consent order for the project, which is currently budgeted at 1.3 billion, breach various heritage and environmental and procedural requirements. However, over more than 70 pages, Mr. Justice Holgate, who actually in July 2021 had blocked a previous development consent order for the project, which was granted by Mr. Harper's predecessor as Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, who's now the Defence Secretary, found that the case put by the lawyers for the campaign at a 3-day hearing last December at the High Court were not in fact arguable in law. We did a report on that, in fact, and we'll link to that below. Anyway, while recognising that the case was not deciding the merits of the A303 one way or the other, it's certainly not about deciding the merits of the archaeology that would accompany the project. The decision was met with dismay by the Save Stonehenge campaign. John Adams, who's the chair of the Stonehenge Alliance and one of the directors of the Save Stonehenge World Heritage Site company, which brought the case, told the media, "In the face of government indifference to the harm this road will cause the World Heritage Site, we had no choice but to bring this legal action. While this judgment is a huge blow and exposes the site to National Highways state-sponsored vandalism, we will continue the fight." And highlighting the political nature of the campaign, which goes to the heart of the Sunak government's perceived pro-car stance, Mr. Adams added, "In the dying days of this Conservative government, which has inflicted so much damage on the country, we cannot let it destroy our heritage as well." Another leading personality connected with the anti-tunnel campaign, Tom Holland, the historian and podcaster, and who's also president of the Stonehenge Alliance, said, and I'm quoting, "This is a devastating loss, not just for everyone who's campaigned against the government's pig-headed plans for the Stonehenge landscape, but for Britain, for the world, and for subsequent generations." However, while it's a major blow to the campaign, it's not yet inevitable that the project will go ahead. That's because there's still a number of legal processes which must play out before the National Highways can send in the bulldozers and the archaeologists, which it's funding, onto the Wiltshire Downs. Now, in the first instance, the Save Stonehenge World Heritage Site campaign has announced that it will seek leave to lodge an appeal against Mr. Justice Holgate's decision. And the campaign has already launched a fundraiser to raise the estimated £15,000, which it needs in the first instance. And there's an expectation that a further £40,000 might be required to fight the case to a conclusion if the appeal is granted. Now, the other factor, which again, a lot of archaeologists who might be saying that the project has now been greenlit and will inevitably happen need to take into account, is that Mr. Justice Holgate stayed, or basically delayed, didn't take a decision on one of the grounds that the campaign has argued, and that's regarding greenhouse gases generated over the life of the project. That's because there's another legal case in the appeal court, this time related to the A47 in Norfolk, which has been brought by an environmental campaigner called Andrew Boswell. Now, if Mr. Boswell is successful in arguing his case, that could yet result in the Secretary of State being forced to change the way they consider greenhouse gases in projects like this, and actually reconsider both projects, the A47 and the Stonehenge Tunnel. So further potential delay at the very least. Finally, it's a general election here in the UK, and a controversial project like this, which analysts suggest could ultimately cost more than actually 1.8 billion as opposed to the 1.3 billion it's currently budgeted at. And with the government's own number crunchers in the National Audit Office finding that it has a significantly lower benefit cost ratio than is usual in road schemes, and where the government's planning inspectors recommended that consent should be withheld because the effect of the A303 tunnel and upgrade would be, quote, substantially and permanently to harm the integrity of the World Heritage Site now and in the future. Well, that kind of project might well be vulnerable to a Chancellor of the Exchequer looking for easy big ticket spending cuts. This morning, at the time of recording, Historic England have issued a statement which, while it welcomes the decision and talks about potential benefits of the scheme, again highlights at the end of the statement the fact that the issue of carbon emissions of greenhouse gases is still outstanding. It's an exercise in fence sitting. You might have noticed that there's been a bit of a hiatus in the watching brief at the beginning of 2024. That was to do with a number of factors, some of them technical, at least one of them to do with the fact that a biblical plague descended upon Archaeosoup Towers, although thankfully now the Red Cross has been rubbed off the door and Mr. Soup's back in action. That means that we're kickstarting the year in February, and we'll be kickstarting the year on Friday with the first edition of Questionable Archaeology. We talk a lot about questionable archaeology, but we're also inviting your questions about archaeology and what you think about archaeology and how you think archaeology is done. You'll see, when you see the programme, you'll see how it works. We'll also be laying out a roadmap for the rest of the year. It's, as I said in the news bulletin, it's a general election year here in the UK, which means that archaeology and heritage and the budgets that are allocated to archaeology and heritage are all going to be up for discussion. Well, at least they're going to be up for discussion if archaeologists make it so. There are also all sorts of other issues about what's the place of archaeology, what's the place of archaeology in our communities. Does archaeology have a place in mental health and well-being, for example, and other areas that aren't directly to do with finding out about the past and communicating the past? There's a lot to talk about. Join us on the watching brief and join the conversation. The Stonehenge tunnel and bypass was one of the first things I think we ever talked about on the watching brief, and I suspect we're going to be talking about it again. And to help us carry on talking about it, if you've enjoyed the watching brief in the past, if you found this bulletin useful, remember you can support the watching brief on Patreon, and there's an accompanying article on the Pipeline Heritage website, and if you buy us a coffee, that would be really appreciated too. See you next time. Bye-bye.